Memoir. I recently moved back to California after 4 years of exile out east. So I thought I'd read actually a section about the first time I saw California. It's my little bit of a love letter to Marin here. Later it would be called the Islamic Revolution, but for a long time the hopes and furies that gripped Iran in the late 70s would be known to Iranians only as the shuruqi, the busyness. In the first months of the shuruqi, when the streets of Tehran were overrun with mobs, tanks, soldiers, and snipers, my grandmother would sit in the dark back room of the hair salon she owned until the cries of Allahu Akbar, God is great, rose from the rooftops of the city. My mother, father, and I landed in New York City with 2 suitcases. My parents bought a silver Buick sedan and headed south and then westward across the U.S. I sat cross-legged on my mother's lap in the front seat, chattering to myself and playing dolls. My mother, lost to her thoughts, braided and unbraided and rebraided my hair. From time to time, her eyes would seize on some detail of the landscape, and she'd point out the window and tell me to look at America. I was 5 years old, and America meant nothing more to me than the plush maroon seats and gleaming hood of that Buick. Persian, then, was just the sound of my mother's voice, and German was my father's. We stayed at roadside motels, slept 3 to a bed, woke early and drove all day. In New York and Fort Lauderdale and Houston, Las Vegas, my mother stayed up long past midnight, dialing her mother's number and then her aunt's, no answer. She let the phone ring 10, 20, 30 times before setting down the receiver. No answer. Every night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, desperate for sleep. It rarely came. By the time we reached Texas, her eyes were ringed with dark circles. When we stopped at gas stations, she bought packages of pink donuts, and when she felt her waist start to thicken, she found that she didn't care. The Shah left the country with a small box of Iranian soil tucked under his arm. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to kneel on the ground and kiss the source of that same soil. Allahu Akbar came the cries across the rooftops of Tehran night after night, God is great, God is great. And all through the shuruqi, my mother too put her faith in him. We crossed into California and spent a whole day circling LA. We were looking for Hollywood. Failing to find it, we settled for a tour of Universal Studios. The Santa Ana wind set the palm trees swaying, mixed the scent of the desert with the scent of the sea. My father took me to Disneyland, and my mother, alone in a motel room in Anaheim, watched the news from Iran, and she wept. From LA, we continued north along the California shore down Highway 1 until we reached San Francisco. When we crossed over the Golden Gate, my mother narrowed her eyes at a strip of coast just beyond the bridge. The light brushed the slate gray water silver, and the hills that skirted the ocean were unlike any we'd ever seen, blonde and rounded and endless. Here, she told my father, because by then she understood that there'd be no going back to Iran, or no going back yet. Like most immigrants, my parents found their degrees and their work experience didn't count for much when they came to America. So they used their savings to buy a small rundown motel on a frontage road off Highway 101, 10 miles north of San Francisco. The Casa Buena, it was called, the Good House. It had 20 rooms, doubles and singles on 2 floors, and a small cottage, the manager's suite, attached to the motel on one end. The parking lot was pitted with potholes, the beds all sagged and creaked, and the carpets and curtains stank of mold and cigarettes. But in those ruins, my parents willed themselves to see their future, to begin again. They worked in shifts, day and night, 7 days of the week. My father took the night shift, snatching at sleep on a tattered powder blue couch in the office. His eyes, too, would soon be ringed with circles. At noon, checkout time, my father napped in the back room, and my mom began her shift at the Casa Buena. She'd pile a day's clean sheets and towels on an ancient, battered olive green trolley, checked her supply of bleach and Windex, and began making her way through the motel rooms. She emptied and polished the plastic ashtrays, collected beer bottles, soda cans, pizza boxes from the floor. She stripped the beds, taking care to air out the mattresses before pulling on the new sheets, dusted the nightstand and the TV, vacuumed the carpet, and then with one ear to the parking lot in case someone had come round looking for a room. My mom splashed the tub with bleach, and to save time, she always threw rags on the bathroom floor and mopped with her feet. Mostly, we rented truckers on their way to Los Angeles. They'd stay the night, leave before dawn, and though they could be gruff, outright rude, it was the locals who always gave the most trouble. They'd stagger into the office when the bars closed, hollering, cussing, slamming down their bills. When they got to their rooms, they'd send the lamps and tables crashing against the walls. Once, a man dragged a half-naked woman into the parking lot and began whipping her with his belt. By the time the police came that night, the woman's face and her shoulders were covered in bloody welts, and the man had made off in the dark. We had long-term lodgers there, too, at that motel. One man stayed the better part of that first year at the Casa Buena. My wife's put me out, he confided to my mom, his eyes filling with tears. There were migrant farmers who spread blankets on the floor and slept their families 6 or 8 to a room. There was a rail-thin, bent-back elderly woman who rented 3 or 4 times every year. She came on foot, her long gray braids messy, oily, carried no bags, not even a purse, stayed 1, maybe 2 nights, and then she just disappeared. It was a long time before we knew that Americans had a name for people like this. Homeless, they were called here, and we never could stand to turn them away. And that's it.